O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology, joined by Dr. Stephen Boyce, and we're going to have a discussion between a Catholic and an Anglican. Dr. Boyce, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me again. It's been a while. I think the last time I was on your show, I had a debate, maybe against Leighton Flowers, maybe?
I was going to say, wasn't it Leighton Flowers? I think y'all were debating Calvinism, right?
I think so. He doesn't debate anything else, so it had to have been that subject because and he's a nice guy, but it's his one horse. So
that's another thing.
But I think that it's been a while, a couple of years.
Yeah, it has been. And so there's been a little bit of change since then. I think last time you were on, you were Reformed Baptist, and now you're Anglican, correct?
Yeah, I was kind of in between at that point. So I wasn't Baptist anymore. I kind of left the Baptist, but I was just more of a Reformed. I don't know what I was. I was searching is really what it was at that point. And then over time it developed. I was always interested in Anglicanism. We had a guy on our team for apologetics who was Anglican in Texas. And so I kind of studied that out for 2-3 years. And in fact, I'm going to be telling my story about it just in a few days coming up on a podcast, on my own podcast, because so many people say, well, where did this come from? Is this last minute? I was like, no, it's been a long time. It's just taken a long time for me to become public with it. But I was always looking into Anglicanism at that point, but it took a while before I made the final move.
But so you were researching a lot of these issues. What was it that really kind of moved the needle for you and moved you from specifically Baptist to Anglican?
So the biggest thing for me was when I did my PhD work for a Baptist university, I had to study a text in Jerusalem. It's a manuscript called Codex H, which has a lot of the early patristics. It's got the 7 letters of Ignatius. It's got the Didache. The only full copy of the Didache that we have in the Greek is in that manuscript. It had the Epistle of Barnabas. So it introduced a world. First St. Clement was in there. Introduced a world for me to investigate these early patristics. And as I began particularly to study the theology of Ignatius, for example, where he clearly believed in real presence, clearly believed in bishopric, leadership within bishopric, ordination, sacrament, terminology of sacrament from baptisms, things didn't look anything like the world I grew up in. So it's taking, all right, these guys were connected, the apostles. Ignatius is in succession to Peter and Antioch, second removed with Evodius between them. And then he's also connected to John the Apostle. Something has to be made of these things. Like something has to come to fruition. Either they just corrupted the whole system, or they themselves were actually truly practicing what they learned from the apostles. And so succession came into view. And then I started studying Irenaeus. Irenaeus was probably still one of my favorite church fathers that there is. And then I started studying Tertullian and what he was saying about Christianity in North Africa. And it just led to a domino effect where at some point, I think if people are true to the historical study of the church and they're in a modern evangelical church, you're going to have to be forced to make a decision. You're going to have to either conclude all of history corrupted itself in the first couple of years after the apostles, which is similar to Mormonism, or you're going to actually push back on the whole system and you're going to go, you know what, I need to change. I'm not in the best place. And so that led to an investigation. So, I started studying everything from Lutheranism to Anglicanism, even Roman Catholic faith, and then also Eastern Orthodox. And, I'm Italian, so most people on my mom's side are Roman Catholic. My wife's side of the family they're Polish, so they're Polish Catholic. So I was always surrounded by Roman Catholics, no matter which way I turn, left or right. So when I look at those things, there's things in Roman Catholicism I really, really appreciate. Everything from their origin to Peter and Paul, to the concept of succession, their record keeping of it. I mean, probably one of my favorite guys to listen to, and I listen to him every day, is Bishop Barron. So he had a huge impact on me to think differently, think philosophically, how to connect in modern times the ancient belief system from the fathers and make it applicable to today. So I had a lot of good influence on that. And then I had friends within the Anglican Church, and there's things that Roman Catholicism believe that I personally could not just bite into and take. And Anglicanism kind of has the things that are close enough to the Roman Catholic faith, but different, where I would rather, in my personal conviction, be different on certain things. Not that I think that they're wrong or evil. I just would feel better in conscience to practice faith in the formation of the Anglican communion, particularly in the older form of it, not so much some of the modern stuff we're going to get into, but particularly how they focused themselves before. So that was a big journey for me, and it was a big decision, and it's not something I took lightly. It took right around 3 years to finally come to an agreement. Eastern Orthodox, to me, I studied them out. I had a lot of friends going Eastern Orthodox, and they were kind of too cliquish for me, I guess. They're a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. I guess everybody does, but it seems like everybody has a chip on their shoulder in that. And but I do love my friends who are Eastern Orthodox, and I love what they do and the work that they put in. But it definitely was not a fit for me at all to go to that. So I was kind of left with Anglicanism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox fell off first, and it kind of broke it down like, all right, where do I fit best? And to me, at this point in my journey, it's been in Anglicanism.
Yeah, and so is it more kind of that's where you find yourself preferentially, or would you say that Catholicism has a false gospel, therefore is just not a possibility, kind of thing?
No, I don't think they have a false gospel. I think what happens is, Michael, is that a lot of people can go into any movement and have a false gospel, even in the Baptist churches. And I think what's happened is, what I found about Catholicism, I was taught my whole life, is they believe this, and then you actually sit down with Catholics, and they're like, no, actually we don't. We do believe that you should trust in Christ and that He is the only way of salvation. It's like, oh really? Oh man, that's not what I was taught. And so when you actually sit down with Catholics and you start thinking, okay, they probably don't agree with me on this, and then you start shooting out at them, and they actually do agree most of the time. But like any movement, there's fake believers in every group: Baptist, Anglican, Roman Catholic, and there's also extremists. The biggest thing for me with Catholicism, what I was taught, was that they do not believe that faith alone saves. You have to earn your way in addition to faith. So it's faith plus works. And I always kind of found that interesting. It's like, where do we draw that line? Because in a Reformed circle, we believe faith and works are inseparable. So if you believe and you have true faith, as James teaches, faith without works is dead. Even a Calvinist or a Reformed camp individual would say true saving faith has works. And so when you look at a Roman Catholic who emphasizes the works and the living out of faith, and you look at the Calvinist, when you look at those two people in life, they're pretty much living out the same thing. It's kind of a semantics debate at that point, because both are emphasizing works are necessary to produce genuine faith. But it was always that, well, no, Catholics are depending on works to save them, and it's a false gospel because it's not Christ alone anymore. And to me, it's not that simplistic. The more I sat down with my family members and friends in the Roman Catholic Church, they're like, no, that's not how we believe. So I don't think Roman Catholicism has a false gospel. I think personally that they adopted things, particularly in the medieval ages, that became more traditionally influenced into the church and practiced, that I personally wouldn't hold to, and I don't think are necessary. I think those things developed. I don't know. I don't think they make them a false gospel per se. I like, for example, I don't look at you as an unbeliever and other friends. And I have, family members that live within a rock's throw of me who are Roman Catholic. I believe they're genuine, believing Christians who love the Lord. period. I mean, that's it. I
But
have a
you would just say there's some, but you would just say there's some theological error there, though it may not be
Yes.
something like soul destroying another gospel kind of thing, but it would be something that you would say, look, I think that's theologically just not true.
Sure. Yeah. A perfect example would be purgatory.
Mhm.
I've investigated purgatory. I'm an open-minded person. I'm open to anything
Mhm.
that is confronting or objective. I want to know the truth. I don't want to be in something because I'm comfortable. I always wanted to. I mean, obviously that's the case. I left a movement that was very difficult. I spent my whole life in, took a lot of criticism, lost a lot of mentors in. But at this point in my life, I don't care about that kind of stuff anymore. Like I want to be in the right place. I want to be
Sure.
in the biblical place. So
Of
like
course.
studying things like purgatory, and seeing the argumentation behind it, and I was open-minded about it. It's like, yeah, I don't see it. I don't.
And what point, like specifically about purgatory, would you say is just kind of like that's just not convincing?
Particularly, I kind of have a different view of the afterlife to begin with. So let's just back up to the whole Maccabean influence. It's like I'm not even sure that story is explicitly teaching it that way. So that's one of the big things you got to read the Maccabean, where it talks about after this battle and that there were prayers and so forth. And it's like, okay, but that's not like a clear cut statement either. It could be interpreted a couple of different ways outside of that. I know that's not the only argument, but to me, it wasn't influential enough to change me. Also, I have a different belief of death. And in studying the Old Testament, particularly, you don't see much emphasis on death in the sense of your disembodied soul goes into a compartment. Most of the Old Testament saints seem to carry the idea that they were dead and they were awaiting resurrection. Their emphasis, their hope was you die, your spirit goes back to the Lord, like Ecclesiastes. Not that you go to this intermediate state where your body and soul remain separated. So I actually kind of have adopted the view over the years, and I get a lot of criticism for this, that when we die, we die. And when we die, the next thing we're going to consciously know is the resurrection.
So it would be maybe a version of soul sleep, but there will be a conscious existence after the resurrection.
Correct. I don't take soul sleep into consideration as the JWs do, for example. I don't think it's soul sleep. I just think that our body and soul are one, and when we die, the spirit of life, the gift of life that was given us, it's breathed into us, it goes back to God, and He promised, and our faith before death is that He will return this back to me, as He said, and it's completely out of our control at that point. It's God sending it back. So most of it was not so much like the Maccabeans or anything like that. It was just studying the old, and really oddly enough, it was Bart Ehrman who wrote a book on heaven and hell.
Oh yeah.
Which he honestly didn't do a great job. But he's not a good theologian. Let's just put it that way. I mean, we can talk about some of his textual critical work because that's where he really is at his best. But lately, I don't know if you've noticed, he's been publishing more in theology. But he did pose some really good questions that I thought was fair about investigating the Old Testament, Jesus's teachings, and particularly the Greek philosophy influence of what the afterlife would even look like, and some of those things. And I do think that in the Hellenized period, that there was some influence in the Jewish thought that led itself over into after what we would say the New Testament period. So I just haven't been really necessarily bought into that. Now, here's what I tell people all the time. If I die and wake up in heaven, I mean, I'm not going to complain.
Of course. Yeah. But I just want to make sure that I'm understanding your position correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
You would say, however, when a person dies, and obviously prior to the general resurrection, they're not conscious, correct?
Right. Yeah. You are what you were before you were born.
Okay.
The only difference is God has left behind a part of you that He promised to bring back, whether it's ashes, whether it's bones, one bone, two bones. I mean, God made us from dust. He can take any particle He wants, resurrect that body. And then the very existence of who we are, the identity of who we are, the breath of life of who we are, that was
Yeah.
given to us will be gifted right back to us, similar to the dry bone scene you find
Sure,
in the
of
book of
course,
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel. But
Mhm.
so it wouldn't just be purgatory, I think, that would be the thing you would disagree with. I think you would also disagree with the dogma in Catholicism that the saints enjoy the beatific vision prior to the general resurrection. I think you would deny that, correct?
Correct. And then even into the prayer to the saints and the intercession of the saints.
That makes sense. Yeah, I
Because
mean, there's no point in praying to somebody who's unconscious.
no, I
Yeah.
know we do know that. I mean, obviously, there are Anglicans that do actually pray or
Mhm.
think to,
Sure.
and they're in a smaller group, but there are those that actually believe there's nothing wrong in praying to the heavenly bodies of saints to
Mhm.
intercede for us and so forth. They're in a smaller group of beliefs, but there are Anglicans that believe that. I sat down with my priest in the Anglican church, and we've actually had a almost 3 hour conversation about this,
Mhm.
and we obviously don't agree.
Sure.
And that's kind of the nice thing about Anglicanism. And then I found that there are actually Anglicans that do hold my position. So there is kind of
Sure.
a diversity of opinion about the afterlife, even with Anglicanism, I found.
Yeah, it's not like dogmatically settled or anything in any way.
Correct.
So,
But
yeah,
I'm not opposed to, like, this is why I say, I mean, I tell people all the time, it's like, I'm not even dogmatic on the position. This is just
of
what
course. Right.
investigation has led. It's like, if I die and go to heaven,
That's just where
I'm not
you're
going to
at
be mad.
theologically.
Like, I'm going to be fine.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's just where you're at theologically, but it's not a hill for you to die on. You're happy to
Correct.
be wrong. I'm curious though, like, what do you do with passages in the apocalypse that speak of the martyrs under the altar in heaven and they're
Yes.
crying out for
Justice.
vengeance?
Uh-huh.
Would you say that that's more just kind of poetic and rhetorical, or how would you understand that?
Yeah, so that was one of the two major passages that really I got hung up on for a while. But then I actually had to teach apocalyptic literature, and I was really not wanting to do it, but I was asked to teach an entire series on apocalyptic literature from the very earliest usages of it back in Isaiah and Ezekiel, Zechariah, etc. So when I got familiar with the language, I started changing also my eschatological views. I
Mhm.
began to realize that, wow, I'm on the wrong side of perspective of exegesis on these passages. And one of the things that I found about apocalyptic literature is when you start taking them overly literal, you end up becoming exegetically incorrect.
Mhm.
And so the terminology there, these souls around under the altar and they're crying out for their blood of vengeance. That's meant to take us back to particularly the
Genesis.
story of Abel
Yeah,
and
Genesis.
his
Right.
blood cries out.
Right.
And so it's to me, and that's not just there. I mean, in all of those places you find similar terminology, and as an apocalyptic literature, which is almost the key to unlocking it, is the Old Testament, because they're alluding to a lot of Exodus, a lot of Ezekiel. John loved Ezekiel.
Mhm.
A lot of the imagery there, the beasts and their formation, going
Sure.
back to Daniel, all of them are meant to take us back to an idea. And that idea is Abel was murdered by his brother. His brother was not serving full justice on it, and the blood was crying out to God to do something about it. And I think that it is a similar situation in that perspective. When you take the book of Revelation, you look at these saints, they're doing what Abel was doing. Their blood was crying out. And it's interesting in that passage, Michael, that one of the things that we find that was said to the souls is to go back and rest a little bit longer until the end.
Mhm.
Why was he telling these souls to go sleep? Not again, not soul sleep in the sense of JW. He tells the souls to go back to sleep until the end or the consummation. So even if it was like literal or something like that, it's like, why is he telling these souls to go back and rest? Now, again, there could be, well, that just might because they're in their state of rest, so to speak. So again, it's too iffy there, but
Yeah.
I think apocalyptically, it's just meant to take us back to the thought process of Abel's blood crying out. I think that's the same idea.
That's always been the response that I've thought about is,
Sure.
Abel's blood. Now, obviously, I don't hold to that position. I hold to the Catholic position, but what I'm saying is, I figured that was probably where you were going with it. So,
Sure.
yeah. Now, also before we kind of move into some other subjects, I'm curious, what moved the needle for you from Baptist ecclesiology, specifically to like an episcopate? Because as you
Sure.
know, plenty of Baptists and even Presbyterians are going to say, look, the episcopate is something post-apostolic.
Yep.
And they're going to argue, however helpful this thing was, historically, it's not necessarily apostolic in nature. What helped you work through that?
So that was one of the first things I changed on.
Mhm.
That goes back to the Ignatius letters.
Mhm.
High emphasis on the episcopate. Polycarp, his letter to the Philippians, I was able to do my own transmission and translation of it very deeply into the language of Polycarp.
Mhm.
So when studying Polycarp as a bishop, his disposition, his idea of leadership, his correspondence with and referring to Ignatius's letters, and Ignatius writing a personal letter to him, you start seeing something is set up here that they did not set up themselves. Tertullian talking about the promises of the apostles and their teachings, and then entrusting that to their successors. And he gives examples. He gives an example of Clement from Peter, and he gives an example of Polycarp from John, and how they were entrusted with the deposit that was given to them. And that when there was a time to, whether or not something, a belief or a document came out of the apostolic age, the way that the churches would check that would be to go to the registration of bishops. It's like, okay, that's very, very early here. And so when people say, well, that came much later, but how much later? Ignatius knew the apostles, probably two, if not one, of the apostles. Clement was trained by Peter and Paul. He's mentioned by Paul. Did he just self-exalt himself there? I mean, did a universal church where you have bishops in the East, bishops in Rome, bishops in Antioch, all of these bishops, the episcopate, are everywhere. Did they just have some secret meeting in the middle of the highest persecution to decide, hey, let's do away with the system the apostles gave us. Let's set up a new hierarchy. And then they just went back to their local towns and just started setting these up universally without schism. See, to me, if there was going to be an episcopate that was going to come on the scene, and it was going to be to take power over the churches in authority, there would have been major schism between East, West, or Jerusalem and Antioch. There would have been major fights. And there wasn't.
Yeah.
We have no record of schism. Also, the term overseer is used by Paul. We see the function of it in Titus, for example. He's telling Titus, I've sent you to Crete to ordain elders in every city. He's serving as a successor of Paul's authority. Paul talks about laying hands and imparting a deposit to Timothy and guard that deposit. He's doing succession work right there, the very meaning of succession. So you have the biblical text explicitly saying overseer, bishop. So I know that everybody wants to, well, pastor, elder, bishop's all the same. But that's not how they were functioning, because clearly elders that were being ordained in Crete were responding to the authority of not the apostle Paul, but Titus, who was given authority by the apostle Paul. So Titus cannot just be a fellow elder. He must have been something more to have the authority to lay hands and approve of men to lead the churches in Crete. And so then you piece it together with their successors. Clement's mentioned in the book of Philippians. All of a sudden, he's a successor to Peter in Rome. You have Ignatius, who's after Evodius and Peter in Antioch. You have Polycarp, who's right after. So they all have uniformity. They had no counsel over this matter. They were just doing what was handed down to them. Tertullian talks about their trail of succession. He talks about their deposits. If the episcopate was a later development, then it is a worldwide conspiracy in the midst of the greatest persecution of the church. And that how highly likely is that? Almost impossible.
Yeah, without it being contested. Yeah,
correct.
And universally received. Yeah. So that's a good point. And one more question before we kind of transition here. So I want to make sure I understand your perspective. Do you hold to a version of sola scriptura still, like a prima scriptura version, where you would still say, scripture is this sole infallible rule, but you still have these other rules like councils and stuff like that, but they're not infallible? What's your position here?
Sure. Yeah, I've recently changed on this too. I actually hosted a discussion with 2 Anglicans and Lutheran the other day on this, and I am more prima scriptura these days. Sola scriptura doesn't work in certain circumstances, and it's too really. And the way Luther was using it is not how most people are using it today. And I got to be careful when I say that. But the way that Luther was even practicing sola scriptura is not the exact same way that we are in most evangelical churches.
How would it be different?
So the way that most people are using sola scriptura today are pretty much saying solo scriptura, that scripture is like the only thing that we can use. Luther was an Augustinian monk. So clearly in a lot of his work, and even contesting against the Roman Catholic Church at his time, he was using early writings of the fathers to do it. So, I mean, you don't see most people who hold the sola scriptura today using early patristics and writers to make points. Also, the point that I would make is that we have multiple authorities. I think church councils are authorities. The problem with sola scriptura as well is if we're holding to sola scriptura, we have to define what scriptura is. Luther didn't have the same canon that most Protestants do today as it relates to. So it's like, so in Luther's mind, you can't use books like James and Hebrews and Esther to make a statement of infallible declaration, because in his mind, these books were spurious. And so his canon's not even our canon. So sola scriptura can't even create a canon. So we can't have sola scriptura exist until we actually had another authority come behind us. And because obviously my PhD is in canonicity. Canonicity, you cannot develop a canon just using the scriptures. I know there are people in conservative evangelical churches who are screaming at your screen right now. You cannot come up with the same canonical books in the Protestant Bible, 66. I know y'all have more. You cannot even come up with 66 just using intrinsic reliability. You can't. You have to have an external source. You have to have a traceable source. You have to have that chain of custody. You have to have the work that's talked about by Tertullian to the registration of the churches, their bishops. What were they guarding? What were they quoting? What was the liturgical readings? You have to go back through all that to come up with a canon before you can even have scriptura be your only sole practice of faith and authority. So I think that God has given us many authorities for the church.
Sure.
I do believe that I think where we might differ is I think the Bible is the only infallible one, but it's not the only one for the church.
Of course. Yeah, prima scriptura. So, but you would say this rule that determined the canon is not an infallible rule, correct? So would that not then mean, okay, this is a fallible, at least potentially fallible collection of infallible books?
I think that's fair. If I understand your question, I think that's fair. I don't think that
there's no infallible counsel that you would point to that would say, hey, here's an infallible rule on which books belong.
Correct. Yeah. So I think that there's enough evidence to make an argument without having an infallible counsel or like a magisterium, for example. Yeah. I think that Nicaea, I actually made a statement just the other day on my podcast about Nicaea. We were talking about the statement of, I did an episode on priestesses and deaconesses, and actually criticizing the idea that there is no such thing as a priestesses. And that it's interesting that a lot of churches hold to the Nicene Creed, but they don't read the canons of Nicaea either, because clearly in the statements of Canon Nicaea, I think it's Canon 19, it dismisses any kind of woman priest. And it allows for deaconesses, but not the blessing from them. It's like, okay, so don't hold to the creed and say, well, we believe this. This is the declaration of what the churches actually believe. And that statement is reflective of an infallible statement of Scripture's teachings, but then ignore the rest of the canons either. So I'm very careful when I use the word infallible, because I believe a council can meet and get 100% of their decisions right.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know if that I would say because they did that, they're now infallible, because they might meet next week and make a 90 on it. You know?
I mean, I could make a, statement that's 100% accurate, but I'm not an infallible rule.
Sure.
So, yeah, sure. So which councils would you say are normative for you? Like, would you hold to the first 7 ecumenical councils, or?
I like the first 7 ecumenical councils. I like.
You'll venerate icons.
Well, I said I like them. I didn't say I hold to them.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
I like anything that the churches worked together to come up with clarity on.
Mhm.
And whether or not I agree with all of them,
Mhm.
I appreciate them.
Mhm.
Even elements, and I am not I don't like Vatican II kind of guy, but there's things about Vatican II I do like. I'm one of those people that doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm one of those people that tries to find good in things too. There's a lot of things in Vatican II that I cringe about. There's too much universalism in there to me. And
In
it's
Vatican
funny, a lot,
II, universalism?
kind of. I mean, it seems to be lending. Even I was actually watching Bishop Barron talk to Ben Shapiro
Mhm.
about this, and he talked about the provision. It's not the word universalism, but the provision that's in there for people that are not of believing faith outside the faith, like a person like Ben
Uh-huh.
Shapiro,
It's not
who's
universalism, though. Yeah, Lumen Gentium, paragraph, I think 15 is what you're referring to. That's not universalism,
it
though.
opens the door for it, does it not?
No, no, not at all. What it opens the door for is that there could be some people who are part of the church informally rather than formally. That's all it opens the door for. It does
Right.
not open the door for
But
universalism. Because just go and read paragraph 16 right after that, and it's emphatic. More times than not, Satan deceives people, and they've exchanged the truth for a lie. And then it quotes Romans 1. So it wants to indicate rather there's a pretty pessimist view of people who are formally outside of the Catholic Church. So while it leaves open the potential possibility for a person being a member of the church informally, it seems to take a very pessimistic view on how often that occurs. But that's not a statement on, well, does this occur in every single person's situation, and then give an affirmative answer for that. That would then be universalism.
sure, it just seems even how Bishop Barron was using it for Ben Shapiro was that
Yeah.
you're a Jew that doesn't believe in Jesus, but because you're following your conscience of the law of Moses, that is sufficient.
No. That's not sufficient. I
He
remember
didn't,
what he said.
he didn't use the
But
word sufficient, but it basically, God will use that as your standard. That would be
mm,
your standard. That's
here,
kind of how he explained it to Ben Shapiro. I was actually just watching it the other night, and I was like,
I know. Yeah. I rewatched it again not long ago. Here, and by the way, we need to distinguish between Barron's view versus Vatican II, because I've often pointed out, as much as I like Barron, his view on specifically this issue isn't very reflective of Lumen Gentium, in my estimation.
right, but isn't that the point I was making? Is that it leaves some debate there to its
Mm,
ambiguity.
Okay, but even going based on what he's saying, he's still just noting there's a possibility that Ben Shapiro could be engrafted into the covenant informally, not necessarily saying that he absolutely is, and therefore everybody is. That would be then universalism. So I don't think that it affirms that, but I would say this: wouldn't you recognize that God could save somebody without being a formal member, a formal Christian? Like they actually are consciously affirming the Trinity and all of the proper dogmas of the faith. Would you recognize that it's possible for that person to be engrafted into the covenant, or would you
Yeah.
say
So,
just no?
I, the way I view the scripture, particularly Romans 1 and 2, that God has given creation to humanity to acknowledge a creator.
Right.
It's not enough to save him, but it is enough to condemn him. But here's what I also believe: that God in his mercy has given us evidence of himself in creation, Romans 1, conscience, Romans 2, the law written on the heart. And that when we choose in faith to follow the light, if you want to use
Mhm,
that term,
mhm.
I think God continues to give more light, which leads us to those things. Now, obviously, I believe if somebody's believing the light that God has given by drawing, my soteriology would show that that person's already on the path to
Mhm.
salvation. And
Sure.
I have no problem with somebody who's in obedience to that light, God in his mercy, if they were to like
That's all
tragically
Vatican
die or
II is
something.
saying,
Yeah.
though. That's
I
literally all it's saying.
I know, but it's interesting how many people have taken it to actually tell Islamists and even people
Mhm,
like Ben Shapiro and Judaism,
mhm,
almost comforting them in their system. Like,
mhm.
hey, there's a chance for you. To me, and it's not easy to be put on the spot in front of 2 million viewers in a live stream and
Right.
say, hey, I think
Yeah.
you're in trouble, Ben.
Yeah.
I don't
I
I don't
get
know if
that, I
that's
get that.
like, I mean, it's but
Mhm.
I fear that I don't ever want to give somebody false hope.
Oh yeah, I think we're in agreement here then, because I would say theologically, what Lumen Gentium is saying, I don't have an issue with, and it sounds to me like you wouldn't either. Well, I think what we're both probably in agreement on here is, in practice, people kind of disregard that and tend to give people more hope than they should.
Yes.
We tend to assume those exceptional cases, rather than challenging them. And I would just point to the fact that the practice of the apostles was to challenge people, not to just assume, hey, well, there's potentially some exception here that will allow you to be an informal member of the covenant. And so therefore you just go your way. No, they preached the gospel to them. And they called them to turn away from sin and
turn
to
away
embrace
from
the
those
covenant.
things. Exactly.
Yeah. And to come into the covenant. And so I want to say, in practice, I think that a lot of Catholics do fail here. I think some of that was a lot of propaganda. If you look at the era, in the post-conciliar era, there was a lot of false claims being made, and people would say, hey, Vatican II now just teaches that it really doesn't matter what you are. And a lot of people wouldn't go and read the documents. They would just assume that that's true. And so it caused a lot of people to kind of soften that proclamation of the gospel. And I would have to say that's an issue. And when you look at the popes, they're pretty emphatic and still telling people, no, we need to go. And like Pope Francis and his and Evangelium Gaudium, I believe, Evangelii Gaudium, he is clear, paragraph 14 and 15. Everybody has the right to hear the proclamation of the gospel, and it's non-negotiable. We shouldn't compromise on that. So it sounds to me like we're actually in agreement here.
Yeah, if what you're saying is true, completely. I mean, again, this is some of the issue I have with some of the councils, and it's going to actually come up in our discussion in a minute on the most recent publication.
Mm-hmm.
Is there's a lot of ambiguity that leaves less clarity and more questions. And I think Vatican II, in places like this, I know in your mind that it's clear because of following paragraphs, but when people are trying to find a loophole,
mm-hmm.
when you give them anything, they'll take it. And the perception of Vatican II has been, whether Catholics are getting it wrong or not, has been that there is this opening for all outside of Christendom, as long as they're faithfully pursuing morality, the law for Judaism, or their devotion in Islamic faith or whatever, then the door is open to the covenant for them too, as long as they're, following faithfully and genuinely and consistently and things like that. That has been the sermons from Vatican II, so to speak, that's been gone on for a long time. Whether or not people are misrepresenting it or not, I think this is where clarity and definitive lines need to be made. And all groups have this issue. Anglicanism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, we all have places where I think we're not clear enough and we didn't draw the line strong enough on certain things. Soteriology is one of those places where I just think it's a non-negotiable. But again, we all have our issues in all of our camps on this. But all that to take us back to the original point, I have an appreciation for all ecumenical councils, even if I disagree with things in them.
Yeah.
So,
and
I
want
are very important, in my opinion.
And I want to follow up on that real quick too, because I don't accept the position that Vatican II is ambiguous, especially on this point. But let's just go with that. Let's say that that's true and that I'm just mistaken. Okay. Well, hasn't the Vatican very emphatically clarified these points with Dominus Iesus, among other documents? So it's like, even if it were true, well, there's been plenty of other magisterial teachings that have closed those loopholes, which, again, I don't grant that there are loopholes, but even if there are, wouldn't these other post-conciliar documents close up those loopholes?
Well, I think follow documents of clarification. Even popes after Vatican II have made declarations of clarification for things like this. I'm sure others have too within the magisterium, outside of even the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have priests who actually practice it different than these clarified declarations that come later. And that's the issue. There's so much differentiation even within Catholicism of how to handle statements like that in Vatican II. You may have somebody clarifying after the fact or reasserting it after the fact, but you still have others practicing it wrong.
Of course.
And
there will always be abuses.
And a lot of debate about those things, which is why there is a huge debate. And I don't have to tell you that. There's a huge debate within Catholicism about Vatican II. So,
but here's, I think, the difference between what Catholicism offers and every other communion. Even if there's ambiguities, the magisterium can always come back and further clarify to the point that no more clarity is actually needed. Whereas you can't do that with any other communion that doesn't have a magisterium that can bind your conscience. Because if it's something that can't bind your conscience, it might be an authority, but you, at the end of the day, if you don't agree with it, you could just say, well, I don't agree with it. Now, when a Catholic does that with the magisterium, they're explicitly in dissent. They're not free to dispense with that lack of religious submission of intellect and will to those clarifications. So I think that's kind of where there is a difference, however, with Catholicism.
Did they go back on that one and clarify under that specific? I can't think if they, under that specific clause within Vatican II, has the magisterium returned to add a definitive clarification of that's been proclaimed out into the church?
Dominus Iesus is the document that I think cleared up a lot of confusion, which I don't believe originated with Vatican II. I believe it originated with the critics of it. Here's the thing. It's kind of like this. Look, you can exploit scripture and say, there's all kinds of loopholes and ambiguities in scripture. I don't think that it's scripture that's ambiguous. I think it's more the people who are introducing doubt when there is clarity there. But all the more with the magisterium, because in the case of the Bible, I can't ask the Bible to clarify itself. Whereas I can ask the magisterium, and it can go through this process of clarification to the point that it's no longer possible to contest what it's saying. Like, it's very clear. I'll give you an example. You might not agree with the Immaculate Conception, but you believe that the Catholic Church definitively teaches it for its members.
Absolutely.
And you would say that's not ambiguous. There's a level of clarity there that this is binding on those who belong to the communion. So in other words, the magisterium is capable of granting that level of clarity when necessary. And I don't think that you can find that outside of Catholicism. That doesn't mean Catholicism is true, and it doesn't mean that the magisterium is right. It just simply means that there is this mechanism that can offer that clarification for its members. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things I do like about the magisterium. The attractive part of the magisterium is that there are certain issues that are non-negotiables. They're not debatable. Marriage being one of those. The ordination of priestesses is another one of those. The issue of the virgin birth is one of those. Those things are the Trinity, sacraments. I mean, those are things that, as a Catholic, you don't have to go to bed at night wondering, I wonder if a group of guys will get together and change our entire foundation.
If they did, that would completely falsify Catholicism. Like if you had a pope come out tomorrow and say the Eucharist is no longer a sacrament and we're no longer going to administer the Eucharist, I would say that falsified Catholicism right there.
Sure. And the thing is, it's like there has to be that kind of situation. I know like the Anglicans have the College of Bishops and things like that, and they make decisions and they put things that are, so-called irrevocable, that are guidelines. I think they need to add more to them in some places. But as a result, what we're looking at today, particularly on the subject of marriage, it's an irrevocable thing. Like the church cannot, under its own dogma, start saying, well, you know what? That was a thing in the past. We're going to start doing it anyway. That is the most attractive, and I've said that multiple times in my own program, the most attractive part of the magisterium is irrevocable things like that. The scary part about that is that they could make a bad decision And again, I know that we would differ here. They can make a bad decision and it's also irrevocable.
And then bind the consciences of the faithful irrevocably to an error. Yeah, that's why we have to get through the more fundamental question, and that is, does the magisterium actually have that authority? Because, think of maybe like that you could have another communion. In fact, I think the Mormons might have something comparable that can definitively bind the consciences of their adherents, if I'm not mistaken. That doesn't mean that they're right. That doesn't mean that their teaching authority is right and actually derives from Christ. So we have to ask the more fundamental questions, like what actual evidence is there for the Catholic magisterium to do these things? Because if we're wrong in that, then yeah, it could be that the Catholic Church has definitively bound people to an error, maybe the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption of the Virgin Mary or papal infallibility. That could be binding the consciences of the faithful,
Right.
to something that is wrong, and maybe even some would argue soul destroying. So that could be a serious problem. So it all kind of hinges on, do we buy into this view of the magisterium even having that authority?
And these are good discussions, because there's some people that are outside of Catholicism who would look in and they have their fear about magisterium and any kind of infallible declaration. Then there's people within Catholicism who think that they would never make a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, I'm somewhere in the middle. I always find myself in the middle on things. It's like, I don't see where it's like, well, we don't need stuff like that. Like, we don't need that.
Let me ask for clarification there, because I don't believe it's a Catholic position to say that the magisterium can never err, ever. Like whenever it teaches non-definitively, I think it's granted by all Catholics that it could teach propositionally something that's erroneous.
They would say it's propositional. They would clarify that point.
Mm-hmm.
But then you ask yourself, what does that look like functionally? Like, I'm sure there's illustrations that you can think of in the ancient past with Roman Catholic Church where, decisions were made. And I know there's even points where in the last 100 years, Roman Catholic churches made public declarations of repentance and revokes and things like that from the Middle Ages, and certain decisions that were made. I mean, that happened. I don't know how often that happens in modern times.
They weren't magisterial though. Like we're talking about apologies for the behavior of some Catholics towards certain groups of people.
Sure.
That wouldn't be like anything taught with teaching authority though.
So you can't think of any single point that was made in the past that they have revoked.
So my dissertation is specifically on this topic. I'm open to the position that the magisterium has erred in some of its non-definitive teachings as far as the proposition. I haven't yet seen anything that's conclusive that it has, but I'm certainly open to it, and it could potentially, because by virtue of the fact that it teaches non-definitively, already that tells you it's not going to be inerrant. The potential for error is possible. Now, I will grant the church has reversed some disciplines. And also some of the members of the church have done bad things and sinful things and scandalous things. But as far as teaching acts of the church, even when they're non-definitive, I haven't seen anything that would conclusively indicate that the church has reversed one of its non-definitive teachings. But again, I remain open to the suggestion that they have, and I'm aware of all of the top contenders.
I'll say there's probably a large list of
there's a few contenders here, but I still remain unconvinced with like religious freedom or something like that with Dignitatis Humanae. A lot of people would say that there's a doctrinal reversal there, but I haven't fully conceded that yet. Though again, in theory, it wouldn't be the end of the world if one does, because again, the magisterium, when it teaches non-definitively, could err in the proposition of what it teaches. But those instances that you mention of like concessions where the church has apologized for those things, they weren't for doctrinal teachings.
Yeah, there would be more practice, I would say, or activity. There's a fine line there, and there's such a fine line there too, because one of my perspectives about practices, our practice reflects what we believe usually.
Mhm.
Now, it might not be dogmatically stated in a
Mhm.
council, but practice typically comes from what's believed. And sometimes
Mhm.
when we revoke a practice or repent of a practice, we usually have to find a common root of belief that was wrong, that led to that wrong practice, and uproot that in addition to what was done.
Usually it's due to assumptions that were made, but never doctrinally taught. But I wholeheartedly agree that your practice has to be at least substantially in line with the doctrine. Otherwise, let's say, okay, well, we believe in the sacrament of the Eucharist, right? And valid matter here is going to be bread and wine, right? Let's say, however, the church officially on paper still says, hey, we still believe the Eucharist, we still believe valid matter is bread and wine, but practically from now on, we're going to use Doritos and Pepsi. Like, no, I don't care if you're affirming it on paper. At this point, your practice is such a rupture from what you say on paper that nobody could take you seriously.
Right.
And if the church were to literally, all the churches now start to use Doritos and Pepsi, but we still affirm it's bread and wine on paper, I think that would be enough to say, you know what? I think Catholicism is false. I think it's falsified itself. So I agree at the end of the day, you can't have like a practice that just substantially ruptures with the core teachings of your faith. Like you can't have that.
Good point.
Yeah. But I
Well,
would say in the cases where, the churches apologize, it's for, other instances where you have some of the members of the church persecuting certain groups of people. While the church itself has never taught that, hey, we should go and persecute this group of people, some of its members have done that, and we owed an apology on behalf of those people since they were Catholic.
Well, one of the things about sacraments, if we can jump into that,
Sure.
I've actually come to, as an Anglican, we hold to 2.
Mhm.
You guys have 7.
Some
I
to hold to 7, though, right?
Correct. And I'm working my way up in that. So I've recently spent a lot of time studying the subject of marriage. And sorry for continuing to use Ignatius, but he
Sure.
made a comment in his letter about to Polycarp, actually. In his letter to Polycarp, he had mentioned to tell my sisters, and he goes into this whole correspondence about how the wives should behave and treat their husbands, and then husbands to the wives. But one of the things he talked about in instructing newlyweds was that they would be blessed, if you would, by the bishop,
Mhm.
so that they're not basically marrying for the wrong reasons. And I was like, okay, so if they're practicing bishop blessing over marriage that is instituted within the church and its blessing, there's a connectivity to the sacramental ideas here, even with the church's authority. And so thinking about that very deeply for the last few months, because I did a 3-part series with my co-host going through the 7 letters of Ignatius, and that one really struck. And I actually wrote something on it. It's not fully published yet, but it'll be coming out soon in an article form. And I've got somebody co-writing it with me. I ended up changing my view on marriage. And I actually hold more now than ever that marriage is a sacrament. I haven't had a chance to, I think all of the things that the Catholic Church holds as sacraments are sacramental. At least just like I said the other day on the phone to a priest in the Anglican Church, I said, at worst, these things are sacramental. At best, they're a sacrament. I mean, there's really, to me, there's no way to get away from the minimal effect of this being sacramental.
And define the difference for our audience and how you understand those terms. I know there's a lot of Catholics who understand how, but I just want to make sure we're clear on how you're defining those terms.
So when I would say something sacramental perspective, but not sacrament, it is an institution that it's something that has sacred or sanctifying and grace implied things, but it can be a part outside of the church. It doesn't have to be within the bounds of the church, which is why a lot of people don't hold that marriage is because it's like, well, I mean, I can get married at a courthouse, or I can get married, whatever, fill in the blank. And so something can be sacramental where it's an imparted grace where God can use it as an opportunity of grace, and it is sacred to God, to you, and it has a sanctifying effect on the individual. Whereas in some cases, some would make that line definitive of like how much of that is instituted and poured out on through the institution of the church and its ordained leaders, like ordination or marriage and so forth. So when you're looking at these, it can it be done within the church, without the church? Does it have a sanctifying effect with the church or without the church? So it's kind of, where does it happen? Can it happen apart from the institution? Is it authorized? Is it seen as valid outside of the institution? So that's where something outside of the institution can have a sanctifying effect. God can use it and impart grace in a situation, but it can be outside of the institutional boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in Catholicism, we do believe that grace can be conferred outside of the formal boundaries.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so that's why we would say to Protestants, to baptized Protestants, marrying, we would say that's sacramental. Whereas to non-Christians, marrying, we would say is merely civil and not sacramental.
Civil, correct.
Because there's a difference between a union that portrays that union between Christ and his church versus just merely something that is civil in nature, that might more portray Adam and Eve.
See, this is a big deal too, because my wife and I are actually going to be doing on my podcast, we're going to be doing a show together on Monday. Yeah, Monday. Mm-hmm. And we're actually studying this out. I actually talked to both priests at the Anglican church I attend, and I actually got to talk to the bishop on Sunday because he was at another Anglican church not far from here. And my friend was being confirmed, and I went and spoke to him. And my wife and I, like, for example, we were married outside of the church, being the Anglican church itself. And if Ignatius is right, and that you want the bishopric to pour out their blessing, either directly or indirectly through the priest, you want the authority of the bishop to bless your marriage. My wife and I had long conversations about this. Like, do we now, coming in Anglicanism, do we want to just continue with that perspective? Because like when we came to the church, we had to be confirmed into the Anglican church, and we had to renew our baptismal vows. We had to renounce, and it was beautiful. And I'm almost sad that I got baptized outside, because Anglicans don't actually make you get rebaptized. As long as you're baptized in the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, they'll let you come into the fellowship, but you have to be confirmed and renew those baptismal vows to do it. But you don't have to do the act of baptism again, because one Lord, one faith, one baptism.
Sure.
But what about marriage? And this is something else. I was like, Claire, you and I have not been married within the Anglican church. We should talk to and so actually one of the things that began the discussion is how the Catholics do it is fascinating to me. And I think that the Anglicans have it's hard to find, but they do have a way to do it. To bring somebody in, you can do a vow renewal with a blessing and so forth. And then there's other ways that you can do it, just getting the blessing directly on your marriage after the approval of the individuals, their confirmations and so forth. So I started talking to the priests about this, and just kind of going through this. I talked to Bishop Brian about it when I saw him on Sunday, and he thinks it's great. And so one of the things that I'm working on in a second project, and my wife and I are doing a video on it, and then one of the priests of the church I'm at, we're co-writing an article on calling clergy from any background to start blessing Christian marriages. And one of the things that I want to see done, because one of the things that bothers me about this subject that we're about to talk about as well, going into the blessing of marriage or same-sex unions, etc. We spend a lot of time in Christianity, especially in Anglicanism, because a whole movement split over this subject with the Church of England, on same-sex marriage and why we disapprove of it and why we will not bless it. And that's fine. We need to do that. But what if the best counterculture to the thing that we don't want in our church was reversed by blessing the thing we do want in our church. And that's the right kind of blessings. And I'm all for it. And, I've done multiple weddings. I'm only 34 years old, and I've done probably a dozen weddings in my life. And as I got older, I loved doing people's weddings for them. And I would totally do things different now. But just looking at those things, we always pray and we put our hands on the bride and the groom, and we ask God's blessing on their marriage. It's like, what about the couple that's been married 5 years with 2 kids and working 2 jobs and hardly getting a date night in? What about the family that's got kids in college, and then they move out of the house and the couples almost don't even know each other? They're living on 2 different sides of the house. What about the couples who've been married 30, 40, 50 years who are disinterested with each other and think they don't have anything to learn about the husband or the wife? Like, we need to actually start blessing the right kind of marriages that we want to see and set the standard by having priests have people in their church come forward and bishops authorizing this to their priests, where marital unions within the bounds of God's design, Christian marriages can come before its congregation and ask for the church's blessing on their marriage. And that's something my wife and I are going to be doing. And the bishop approved, even for the priests in my church, to bless my wife and I's marriage, because we were married outside of Anglicanism, and we want the bishop's blessing on our marriage. We want the imparted blessing of God and his grace given through on the laying on of hands and the prayer of blessings. We want that for ourselves. And actually, I think that one of the best things that we can do at this time, Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Protestants, Baptist, whatever, is that clergy actually start blessing the right kind of marriages. I'm actually writing something on that, and my wife and I are doing a podcast real soon, actually asking leaders of churches and leaders of entire dioceses to start blessing marriages across the board that are Christian marriages and unions that we approve and want to see, and to continue to lay hands and bless even beyond the marriage covenant at the initiation, but even marriages that are 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years where they can go down and receive a blessing. I think that's something I think that's the best way to counter culture here. I really do. I think that's something we should focus on more what we're for than what we're against. I'm not saying we don't make declarations and say we're not going to approve this. We don't want these kind of marriages in our church because they're against God's design. They're not a part of what the Christian faith is. I'm all for it. I've done episodes on it. You've done episodes on it. We're in agreement on that. But how about counterculture it and set the standard in the church by showing the next generation of young people who aren't married yet, and the widows and those that are in the church that maybe even love marriage but are called to celibacy or something, that they would actually see the church's beauty and love and adoration for the covenant of marriage that God instituted in the garden. I think we need to do a lot more blessing, and I think priests and bishops could step it up and do some more blessing as we go through these.
Oh yeah. I mean, we have that in the Catholic Church,
Yes.
for blessings after the sacrament has been conferred. I wasn't aware that this wasn't something that was being practiced within Anglicanism.
It is, but it's not as much as it could be. I mean, there's these marriage renewal vows and stuff, and I like that. But it's kind of like, and I kind of told my priest this too. When you look at baptism, we don't have to redo the act. Well, why should marriages that are Christian marriages have to renew the vows? The vows were legit. They were meant, they were consciously declared. They weren't accidental or oblivious. They were legitimate covenantal vows. What's missing from those vows within the Christian marriage between, like, say, my wife and I, we're married, both Christians. We made our covenant to God and to each other. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't oblivious. It was legitimate. What we didn't have is the church to come behind us and the blessing of the bishopric on that marriage.
Yeah.
So
now,
do we need to have a whole new or can we affirm our covenants that they were made and then the bishopric bless? And that's something it looks like it's actually going to start happening, particularly within the diocese that I'm a part of.
But you would, however, say that there was a sacramental conferral of grace when you and your wife married, even though it was outside of the Anglican communion? Or would you say no, there was not?
I think so. I think there is, and that's kind of where I draw the line at sacramental. There could be sacramental elements outside the institution of the church and the laying on of hands. But a sacrament has, man, this sounds really bad. The amount of grace that is instituted and guaranteed within a sacrament. See, to me, a sacrament is a guarantee, not a possibility.
Yeah.
When we take Eucharist, we're not hoping like, well, I hope Christ is bodily present here. I mean, that was just hope for the best.
Sure. But
It's a promise.
But okay, so let me make sure I'm understanding. Are you putting a question mark on whether or not your marriage without the blessing of the Anglican communion is sacrament? It was a conferring of the sacrament of marriage. I think it sounds like you're saying, well, for sure it's a sacramental, but maybe not the sacrament itself. Did I understand you correctly?
From my position, but not all Anglicans hold that marriage is sacrament. So my thing is, I believe my marriage is legit. I believe God has accepted my marriage to my wife. If I didn't, I wouldn't. I mean,
Sure,
I would have ran to the bishop that day while we were both standing in front of him and give me your hand, please. I believe that God is sanctified and placed his approval. The thing is I personally have come to believe in the sacraments that there's a special grace that is conferred upon the individual or individuals, particularly in the marriage individuals, that is an irrevocable thing. It's
that's the sacrament.
Exactly. The gifts and callings of God are irrevocable.
That's the sacrament. Yeah.
To me, and my wife and I love each other, and we're in it for the long haul. We've been through hell to get to the marriage that we are in now. And, today's world is throwaway marriages, and we see our marriage as a sacrament. We want our marriage to be a sacrament more than we actually, it's not just, do we believe marriage
from the Catholic perspective, it is, by the way.
Exactly. And Anglicans are not all there on that. There's some that do. Like, for example, the priest, one of the priests in my church, Pat Ney, does believe that marriage is a sacrament. That's why he is anxious to help my wife and I and other couples, because the more he and I talked about it on the phone, the more it's like, okay, our Anglican church is a combination of a lot of Protestants who are leaving Protestantism to, well, I guess technically the Anglicans are Protestants, but other groups, Baptists, moving into an apostolic church.
Sure.
Those church members also were married, by Baptists or Presbyterians. If we open the door for our church and with the approval of the bishop, the priest to start blessing the marriages within our church, it'd be a beautiful service. And I think it would be touching. I think it would bring meaning. I think the young people, the teenagers that are there, the college age that are there, that are unmarried, that want to be married, it really will heighten the sincerity and the gravity of what a covenant is. Let's be real, man. I mean, 55% of all marriages end in divorce. Second marriages, it's over 70%. Third marriages, it's over 80%. I mean, we have a major covenantal problem in our common era. And I think the best way to counterculture throwaway marriages, same-sex marriages, unlawful unions, is to elevate the thing we believe God teaches as sacred communion. Here's another reason why I believe marriage is a sacrament. It is the only thing that Paul wanted to focus on when he wanted to give an image of Christ in his church in Ephesians 5. It's cleansed by washing, baptism. It is the image of Christ in his church. It's his bride. And we're loving our wives as Christ loved the church, gave for it. The whole institution is wrapped around the new covenant language. It's all wrapped around the marital language, and it is instituted as the picture of Christ in his church. How can something picture Christ in his church and not be a sacrament? To me, it can't.
And he calls it a mystery.
A mystery, yes. Yes, absolutely.
That's the language of a sacrament in antiquity,
100%. And that's how it was always understood. And the early church fathers all called it a sacrament. So to me, it makes sense.
Now, but you believe that baptism is a sacrament outside of the formal bounds of the Anglican communion, right? So why would there be a question mark on this one for the sacrament of marriage?
The problem is, I think, sorry, my screen went off. Hopefully I didn't go off the screen.
Yeah, it's back now though.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, it was just half a second. It's fine.
Okay. So here's how I look at my baptism.
Mhm.
It was a legitimate sacramental moment of washing, but I do not believe it became a full-fledged sacrament until the bishop laid his hands on my head and confirmed me into the communion. And I gave a renewal of the baptismal covenants when I was at confirmation, because you can't be confirmed without renewing your baptismal covenants. And that's part of the initiation into it. To me, it is a sacrament if it is done under the proper, really the avenues that are given in scripture. I don't think my baptism was illegitimate. Just like I don't think my marriage was illegitimate. But when the bishop confirmed through the laying on of hands and confirming, I think something different happens there. This is my opinion now.
Okay. And I think the reason why is you don't hold that confirmation is a sacrament itself.
I'm working on it.
Gotcha.
That's one of the, again,
that might be one of the reasons though. Because for me, when I hear that, wait, you don't know if you fully received the sacrament of baptism until it was completed through confirmation. I'm thinking, wait, baptism is a sacrament and then confirmation is a second sacrament.
I would see confirmation as sacramental, and definitely okay. If I had to choose, if you put a gun in my head right now and said, what's another one of the 7 that you would have to affirm as a sacrament outside of marriage, baptism, and Eucharist? The next one I would land on is confirmation. See, I'm evolving into these positions, and you
I
know,
get it,
and I hope your audience isn't like, oh, Stephen thinks I don't know everything.
I get it.
This is a journey. I mean, for
me,
I
know that journey very well,
and I don't want to just make a decision. Well, this guy, it makes sense, so yeah, I'm just going to go with it. No. I want to think so deeply that I've covered all my bases, and marriage is the most recent one that's come up, and so it's one that I've studied more in depth. But even if it's not a sacrament, the act of laying on of hands by a bishop who is in succession to the line of the apostles, particularly, and I know how y'all feel about Anglican bishops, but by hand on head, they do continue to go back to the apostles. But by that standard, that bishop laying his hand on my wife's head and my head, and the prayer and the confirmation and the sealing, sign of the cross and all that, to me, that is the moment where my baptism becomes completely valid. Because I renewed my baptismal vow. I don't think the washing of baptism when I was a Baptist was just nothing. Now I know there's disagreement, and even in Eastern Orthodoxy, you got to get rebaptized, and I understand. Like, not
all, by the way, not all.
Is that not all of them do?
See, this is the thing. I mean, plenty of Eastern Orthodox will receive your baptism. They'll just confirm you. They'll receive you by chrismation alone. So it's a huge debate within Orthodoxy. Some will just receive your baptism. Others will not. They'll rebaptize you. They call it corrective baptism. So it's a huge debate in Orthodoxy, but they are not at all on the same page.
So a lot of them around here will make you get rebaptized. Almost all of them that I know of around here will absolutely.
I'll give you an example. The British, the Orthodox bishops of the British Isles just came out with a statement. The Antiochian ones just came out with a statement deposing and threatening for any clergy who rebaptizes someone, corrective baptism, is automatically deposed.
Whoa.
And the person who receives it is excommunicated.
Oh my!
So
goodness.
I mean, there are some Orthodox who say you cannot do this. There are some Orthodox who say you must do this, otherwise you're pagan still. So it's hotly debated. I don't want anybody to get the impression it's all one thing. No.
And I think, thank you for clarifying that. It seems that, would you say the more dogmatic against or that are for the rebaptism are probably the majority view?
I don't know about majority. They might actually be in the minority, the corrective baptism.
Well, then they're the loudest.
But it's growing in popularity. The reason why they're probably still in the minority, though it's grown in popularity, is historically the Orthodox would not rebaptize you.
Well, and that's the thing. The Anglicans won't either. And so my kids were just baptized a month ago. And I was so jealous.
Yeah.
So jealous, in the Baptist churches, and you were Baptist one time, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know how it is. You get them in, you get them down next,
Sure.
next.
Sure.
My kids are sitting there making their own public profession.
Yeah.
They're revoking the world, the flesh, the devil. They're
Sure.
doing the Apostles' Creed. They're being Christian. I mean, I'm sitting there like, I want to get rebaptized. Like, like it's like the
I want to go
gravity.
through that too.
Yeah, I mean, and I hate to downplay, my baptism, but it's done in such in
I
a
get it.
sectarian group, and it's like, man, I want
I
that,
get it.
but one faith, one Lord, one baptism concept, and I understand the Anglican position there, but I also appreciate that we can do baptismal renewal.
Mhm.
And to get into the communion, you actually have to be confirmed by the bishop in a baptismal renewal, and all the same things that my kids did in their baptisms, I had to say as well. And I had to revoke the world, the flesh, the devil, and make confession and proclamation that I believe this. I'm trusting in the Old New Testament scriptures for the faith. All those things that my kids did, I had to do as well. I was also anointed with oils. I mean, the same thing that they received. The difference is I didn't go in water and come back out.
Yeah. Of course. But you did everything else. Yeah.
But to me, so that becomes a question of, all right, so you have a sacramental thing, and then you have a sacrament. Can something be sacramental without being a sacrament? Yes. But what if they're the same act? When does it become sacrament instead of just something that was sacramental that happened to you? I think it's the laying on of hands. I think it's the confirmation. I think it comes from the institution, the church, which would lead me to say, yeah, I can see why confirmation would be also a sacrament. It does seem to fall in line. And that's why I'm actually reading more of the Anglicans who do hold to 7. And they make sense. And again, I just don't want to go, okay, well, 4 makes sense or 3 makes sense, so I'll just go ahead and accept all 7. I want to work through every single one of them. And,
of course.
And ones that are the most important to me. Obviously, Eucharist and baptism were the first 2 that I would change my mind of before I became Anglican to begin with. Those 2 were sufficient to actually give me to be comfortable in the Anglican communion, because it's really the only 2 you have to actually be Anglican. Then now marriage, just in the last maybe 2 months, has just, it's like, I don't see any reason to excuse this anymore as a sacrament anymore. And I'm done trying to excuse it as just being sacramental. But then it was like, but what do I do about it? Because I was married outside of the Anglican church. So we went to our priests, and they're like, hey, that's really good. And then I was like, well, here's what the Catholics do. I actually found Catholicism's method of doing it. And then I found that the Church of England has something very similar. And then there's even subsections within even the ACNA that has documents that actually give protocol for priests to do things that are very, very similar. The problem I had with it is, why is this so hard to find? Like, this should be on the front.
I was going to ask. So my question for you was going to be, look, it sounds like this is really important to you. You've thought through it tremendously. In Catholicism, this already exists. If it is really important, why isn't this already emphasized in Anglicanism? Why isn't it already there?
I think the problem is that Anglicanism and particularly the ACNA they're so new. They're fairly recent. And even the bishop said this to me on Sunday. Bishop Brian said this to me on Sunday. He said, there's a lot of because he said the Episcopal Church does this a lot. So this is not so much like all Anglicanism. The Church of England has an edict for it, and the Episcopal Church, it's and I love the honesty of Bishop Brian. This is exactly what he said. He said, we left behind so many things in the Episcopal Church because of the things they were doing, that we also left behind some good things too.
Just for people who are not familiar,
sure.
Talk about ACNA versus the Episcopal Church versus So please break that down for some people who might not be familiar with these acronyms and concepts.
All of which would be considered Anglican. Which, if you want to take it down to liberal to conservative, except for the Reformed Episcopal. The Reformed Episcopal are actually very conservative. They're a smaller sect. But obviously the big issue, in the 80s, there was a major break. In the 60s, there was major issues that came between the Episcopal Church, where Anglicans here in the United States particularly We're having issues of liberalism. Liberalism leaked in just like it did in other like Lutheranism got hit with it really hard at that time.
Everybody did.
Yeah, it was bad. The United Methodist Church, I mean, it was
Everybody.
There are very, very small, and I'm actually learning there's multiple sects of Episcopal. I met a guy the other day. He was like, I'm this kind of, I don't even remember what it was. I was like, I had to Google it to figure out like, what in the world is that? I've never heard of that kind of Episcopal. Very small group. I think they have a total of 20,000 or so members in the whole United States. But they have rejected, and one of the biggest issues is marriage. The very issue that the Church of England is dealing with right now on same-sex marriage, women priestesses, that was a big one that happened in the 80s and 90s. So a lot of the churches that were part of the Episcopal Church started accepting, there's Episcopals that don't even accept the Trinity. I mean, I was reading somebody the other day, a priest, and he said that this is not something we can be dogmatic about because it's not explicitly stated in Scripture. It's like, say what? Like, what creed do you hold to then? Like, you might as well just get out. Like, leave Anglicanism because you have nothing in your foundation anymore.
But it's like, but can you really press them on that point and say this creed is definitive? Like, who produced the creed? Well, a council, but you're going to say that council is not necessarily infallible. You might agree with its theology and its creed. But if they say, hey, well, it's not infallible and I don't agree with it, I guess what would you do to press them on the point? You would just say the concepts are biblical?
Well, I would say, A, biblical, B, councils still have authority, especially if it's a college of bishops who are using the biblical authority in addition to the historical approach. And that's one thing the Anglicans emphasize a lot. It's not just the biblical. That's the difference between them and most Protestant groups is it's like, well, sola scriptura. No. We have scriptural reason for this. We have historical reason for this. And we have council reason for this. So I don't know of a single Anglican group from whether you're in Australia or in South America, Africa, Europe, here in the U.S., all Anglicans are supposed to hold to at least 3 creeds, particularly the Nicene, the Apostles, and the Athanasian Creed. So how can you be an Anglican if you deny the Trinity, where all 3 of them are Trinitarian explicitly in the Athanasian Creed, and we even follow in the calendar Trinitarian Sunday?
What if they were to say, look, there's other councils in the first millennium that denied the Trinity?
But they were heretics. So they need to go join the heretics.
But how do you determine it? In some odd cases, some of the same men who made up the Orthodox councils had previously been in councils that were rejected.
The difference is when they're appointed to bishopric and priesthood, they're committing to this faith. So they're breaking their commitment to the faith that has already been instituted by the church and its leaders and its councils, or its college of bishops, if you would. So for them to change that, that's like they would have had to break the entire protocol to get to that point, and should have.
They could be like, look, I don't agree with my Anglican forefathers who thought that Nicaea was a standard. I want to go with X council that rejected homoousios, you know?
Yeah, that we like Arian better. Arius better, so we're going to go the Arianism here.
And they think that they're the Orthodox ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Nicaea, they're the heretics.
See, and that's the thing. It's like, so to me, they have the College of Bishops has every right to remove that person. The problem is that I think the Episcopal Church has become so corrupt that they've just welcomed all ideas, all beliefs, which has led to really the making of not just the Episcopal Church, even the Church of England, institutions in Australia. That's where GAFCON gets formed. Because think about it. I mean, the Anglican communion is made up of about 80 million people in the world. Almost 60 million of the 80 million are a part of GAFCON. The majority of Anglicans are in the conservative side of the church. The Church of England is in the minority. The Episcopal churches are dying. I mean, I continue to go, and I was just talking to a guy the other day. He was telling me about another Episcopal church that's gone down, and then ACNA church has taken over. There was another one, was it Missouri or Tennessee? I can't remember where it was. An Episcopal church was down to like 5 people, and there was an ACNA church that was looking for a building, and they turned it over to them. And then the 5 that remained behind ended up just joining that church, and they took the building. It's happening regularly. The Episcopal church is hurting. There's some really big ones that are doing just fine. But a lot of the smaller Episcopal churches are struggling, and there's a lot of ACNA churches popping up everywhere, which is the Anglican Church here in North America, which has conservative bishops. They're all a part of GAFCON. Archbishop Foley Beach is the archbishop there, and he's also one of the leaders within GAFCON, very conservative. So the Episcopal Church, they went to their liberal end, and then the Church of England did what it did recently, legalizing all these blessings and so forth. And so you got the Free Church of England now out there saying, to heck with this, we're done. We're done with Archbishop. And it's sad because it's the first time the communion's been broken to the level that it is since the time that we, going back to Canterbury and its see all the way into 601. I mean, so when we're looking at the Anglican communion, it is split, but the split's not sporadic split. It's a pretty evenly lined split, and the majority are not on the side of the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Episcopal Church. They are definitely in the minority on this. And a lot of that's to do with, there's a lot of Anglicans in Africa. They've been very vocal. Their bishops in Africa have been extremely vocal, and in South America. So there's a resurgence of conservatism within Anglicanism. And so with that being said, going back to the prior statement, because the Episcopal Church went so liberal, I mean, not just practice, but doctrinally liberal. We all struggle with this. When we leave something that went really bad, we jump into something, we kind of distance all and every. And I really appreciated what Bishop Brian said. He said, we left behind a lot of bad things in the Episcopal Church, but I think there's some good things that we left behind that we need to bring back. And being one of these things, and being that the ACNA is as young as it is, and I'm excited to be a part of it because it's not perfect. It's got a long way to go. It's a new institution. I actually would love to be a part of seeing the growth of the ACNA continue to have conversations like this, sacraments, blessings, and come to a better and a healthier institution with its college of bishops overseeing the growth of these churches across the country right now. I'd love to be a part of something like that. It's kind of exciting.
Don't you think, though, with the ACNA, because there isn't this magisterium that combine consciences, eventually it's going to end up being made up of people who represent the thought of society, and it itself will become liberalized, and then the faithful among the ACNA will have to break off and form new communions?
There's a possibility of that. I mean, the College of Bishops particularly, that meets, I think they just met in Canada a few years ago and made some big decisions there. There are things that are so-called irrevocable. Like this subject of marriage is something that it's not a debatable matter within our churches. It is a settled issue
within Anglicanism. Yeah.
Within the ACNA, particularly, obviously the ACNA Anglicans can't control the Episcopal Church or the Church of England but if you're going to be a priest or a bishop within the ACNA, you're not blessing gay marriages. You're not blessing same-sex unions. And if you are, you will be removed. I mean, it's not just ambiguous about certain elements. One of the things that I see as important to that is that there is a standard. It is decided by those in succession, the bishops, and those bishops hold the entire communion and its diocese to that standard. Now, obviously, in anything, people can break off and do the wrong thing and have wrong practices, and there are ramifications for that. And if you don't mind, I'd actually have a question about Catholicism on that, because this is relevant to, we see this my point is Catholicism is not exempt for people within the institution to do the wrong thing against
Of course,
council.
we have plenty of dissenters
And
who
one of the
reject
ones,
the authority. Yeah, absolutely.
and one of the ones that I've been concerned about lately, particularly, is and I know you did an entire program on James Martin and what he's been doing, and I'm pretty sure you called for discipline to be done on him. Am I wrong?
That's correct. I did.
So what I haven't seen anything that's led them to do that yet. Why is it taking so long to respond to his wrongly? And because you would conclude that he's not properly following the document. So what do you expect anything to be done?
Considering the fact that we've had James Martin abusing sacred scripture way before he abused it, magisterial documents, and he hasn't been disciplined yet, I don't know why he would be disciplined now. I mean, he's done worse things than this. So my thing, however, is it seems pretty abusing the words of our Lord. That would be number one. I think that's worse than twisting some magisterial document. It seems that he even puts into doubt certain definitive teachings of the church, like whether or not homosexuality itself, like the act itself, is sinful. And I think that's pretty grave, and that's been going on for a while. So it's like, if he hasn't been disciplined by now, I don't know why he would all of a sudden be disciplined for this. But you realize consistently, unfortunately, across the board, we've been having issues with discipline on even the other end of the spectrum. Like, we, for crying out loud, have a guy who's archbishop and is a sedevacantist, and openly a sedevacantist, and he hasn't been disciplined. And he, of course, is absolutely against your Father James Martin's. So it's kind of like both sides aren't receiving discipline.
Well, the only thing, like, from my understanding, James Martin has corresponded with the Vatican back and forth.
So is Vigano.
I mean, there were letters of exchange. I think even Pope Francis sent a letter that thanking Father Martin for his pastoral zeal. Particularly,
yeah, he has some good things that he does. I mean, like, the things that Pope Francis is going to thank him for are not is not going to be anything like where he's questioning church teaching or something like that. Like, look at Pope Francis. He's very clear. Homosexuality is a sin. Father James Martin's not on board with that. Pope Francis says that, gay marriage is not a marriage. Well, James Martin's not on board with that either. He says gay marriage is marriage. So obviously Pope Francis is not congratulating him on anything like that. What he does, however, is you'll see other things that Martin does. And he will emphasize the fact that everybody is made in the image of God. Everyone has dignity. And some of these people out here who are struggling with same-sex acts, they need to hear the love that Jesus Christ has for them, that God has for them, that they're made in God's image. That's a good message. That's a good thing. And those are things that Pope Francis, I think, admires and congratulates him for. The problem is, along with that message, he also has this other message that comes along. And it's a little less in your face. The one that if you listen to Father James Martin, the one that's in your face is, these people have dignity. They're made in God's image. God loves them. That's the one that's in your face, and that he shows to Pope Francis and everyone else. Behind the scenes, however, you start digging more and more and start looking into some of his articles and tweets and stuff. It's like, well, you have a whole nother message in addition to that one. And this other message seems to imply that you think homosexual acts themselves are not disordered. Now, I've never heard him say just outright homosexuality is good, it's not a sin or something like that. If you've ever seen him say that, let me know. He's a little more subtle than that. But it seems to be assumed in some of the other things that he says. And yeah, I think that it's deliberate, it's intentional, and it's misleading.
The problem is with, if the Vatican already knows that this individual, he's clearly an advocate.
Who's the Vatican?
Particularly from Pope Francis himself.
Do you think Pope Francis is aware of everything that James Martin says on
Oh, I
or
would
Twitter or
be.
something like that?
I mean, if he could be aware of these other things like Strickland and others, I would hope to think that who's making national news, Martin has
No,
made
no, no,
international news on this.
no.
You don't think he's aware of?
I doubt very seriously. I think that what he's being given is very selective information. When you actually listen to Pope Francis, it's shocking how little he's aware of. Now, in the case of Bishop Strickland, you have many bishops contacting Pope Francis complaining about it. I don't know if you really have that in the case of Father James Martin.
Isn't that
I
concerning?
bet, yes, it is. And I bet if the bishops of the United States started causing a problem and started paging Rome, I bet Pope Francis would intervene in the case of Martin.
But
They did.
he had an outreach conference of LGBTQ Catholic Ministry Conference, and Pope Francis wrote a letter
Mhm.
letting them know that he was praying for them. And I think Martin read the letter saying, Pope's praying for you. So he obviously knows what Martin's up to, not just, I don't think he's ignorant that Martin's at these
Doesn't
conferences.
logically follow from what you know. No, writing a letter saying, "Hey, I congratulate you for wanting to proclaim this message that everybody's made in God's image and likeness," doesn't mean that he's aware of everything he says on Twitter or something like that.
No, but I mean, again,
Let me ask you, let me get to a more fundamental question. Since Pope Francis says homosexuality is a sin, and since he says gay marriage is not marriage, and Father James Martin tends to suggest the exact opposite, and in some cases
correct.
explicitly says the opposite, do you think that Pope Francis is just lying whenever he goes and, says something nice about James Martin? Is this like a underhanded way of Pope Francis deceiving people? Like, what's going on there?
I think that Pope Francis is trying to please everybody. That's the way it looks. I don't know his intentions, and I'd be a fool to start speaking on somebody else's intentions. It looks like he's trying to unify as much as possible everybody in every perspective, and he doesn't want to stir the waters. The problem with that is you can't unify this issue. I understand what he's, I mean, I've read what he said, and he's even made it very, very clear this is not a blessing in the sacramental sense. This isn't a blessing from that perspective. It's more the pastoral over people, the individual, etc. Even Cardinal Fernandez has clarified those things. I don't dispute with what they're saying. I don't think what they're saying is like, I just don't know what they believe here. I'm not so sure.
What do you think that is in question on what is believed?
I think they're trying to compromise a little bit too much on this to make everybody happy. Problem is, it's not me. On the subject, like on this, by blessing these individuals. I mean, you and I would all agree that there's nothing wrong with praying for homosexual people at all. I don't have a problem with it. I don't even have a problem with them showing up at church, right? The issue was, I think the biggest issue for me was with Cardinal Fernandez's statement. He said, let's see if I can pull it up. These kinds of blessings are simply simple pastoral channels that help to express people's faith, even of those who are great sinners. Again, I don't know much of us that would differ on that. Therefore, by giving this blessing to two people who spontaneously come forward to request it, one can legitimately ask God to grant them health, peace, prosperity, the things that we all ask for and that a sinner can ask for too. The issue I have with that statement there is not that sinners need prayer and that we want them to get sick and die tomorrow. Like, well, you're homosexuals. We hope you're dead when you wake up, or that you don't wake up tomorrow and that you're dead. But the problem is that realistically, put yourself in your mass. Two homosexuals in a Catholic church already know how their church feel about their marriage. It's declared pretty clearly that it's not approved. It takes a lot of guts for two people knowing the church doesn't approve of their homosexuality to come together in church, sit together in church, and then to both just spontaneously, which I don't think would be a realistic situation, come up together in front of the whole church.
Wait, you're so many assumptions here. Wow.
That's
See,
Cardinal Fernandez's statement, though.
In front of the whole church.
Well, that's what this blessing would be, is specifically talking about. Well, I mean, it could be outside of church. It was left ambiguous. That's the whole point.
No, it specifically guards against anything that would cause confusion or scandal. Now, so if this is being done in any way that would do that, it's excluded. But more importantly, what did Fernandez say right after the sentence, right after that part that you just read to me about health and peace and all that? What did he say right after that?
We ask for all, or no, we ask for, and that a sinner can also ask for, things that we can all ask for and sinners can ask for.
Right after that, doesn't he even give you an example? And then in addition to calling for peace for these people and work and stuff like that, then
health,
a
peace,
call to
prosperity.
Conversion. What about a call to conversion? That's
at the same time, since one can think that in the daily lives of these two persons, not everything is sin, one can therefore pray for them to receive a spirit of dialogue, patience, and mutual help.
Right after that, he continues. In the same section, he continues about how they need to be conformed to God's commands.
Okay.
Now, so I guess my question would be, how is that compromising with the liberals? It's directly against what they want.
Because if they're going up there, for example, praying for them to have peace, prosperity,
and a conversion to conformity to God's commands. But
you got to put yourself in their position. They're not thinking letter of the law. They just want somebody to accept them.
No. You have the wrong group of people in mind. Let me give you, you're thinking about people who are wanting to validate themselves. Now, Fiducia Supplicans specifically refers to, this is not the group of people we're talking about. They're not trying to legitimize anything.
Well,
we're talking about a different group.
I don't think we differ on that, though. I think the problem is this was left the way that it was written for these things to happen, and that's why they are happening.
Not at all, because it specifically guards against anything that would lead to confusion or scandal. So I don't grant that. But moreover, I would point out that there is another group of people here who would recognize, hey, my union is sinful. I know that I'm in wrong, and I want to get away from this, but I'm not fully prepared to offer a firm purpose of amendment in the sacrament of confession. So it's kind of like, I want to get away from my sin, but I'm not fully there yet. It's that St. Augustine moment prior to conversion in his confessions, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet, kind of thing. Like, okay, I know this is wrong. I know this is sinful, and I don't want it anymore, but I'm also not fully prepared to turn away from it. And so it's this group of people who are not trying to validate anything that need some additional graces to get to that point. Now, you might say, well, okay, but sure, but this will be exploited, and there will be plenty of people who don't meet that description. You can abuse anything. You can abuse anything. I don't care how clear you can make Fiducia Supplicans. I don't care how many guidelines and rules. People can disregard those things and abuse them. So, but abuse doesn't negate proper use. So I just don't see it as, convincing. If Pope Francis were like trying to sneak in the door or compromise too far with perhaps German bishops, there's a whole lot of things that he would not have put into Fiducia Supplicans. What do you think of that?
Well, I think this isn't the end of it. I think that this is a beginning of something that needs further clarification. And when that clarification comes, that will answer probably most of our concerns or questions.
What else needs to be clarified?
Well, again, let's go back to Fernandez's statement. What situation would ever call for two people who are in a same-sex union to spontaneously come forward to request? And the idea of coming forward to there is in the context of a gathering. What two same-sex people would come forward spontaneously to receive a blessing. If they're together, that's the key word, spontaneously, they're coming forward together to get a blessing. Now, it's one thing
He
if
gives
there's
you
a
an example.
I know, but if there's a single individual in there that's a homosexual or struggles with homosexual attraction and they're going forward, that makes sense because they want to change. They're struggling. They're asking for a blessing. Two people who are already in a same-sex union, they're not looking to go to repentance. When they go for
That's
a
not
blessing,
true. That's not true. That's just factually not true. There are plenty of people who are in these unions who want to be freed from them, but they're not entirely ready to, completely detach.
you would
That's
say
just
that's in
not
the
true.
majority?
I didn't say anything about majority. I said that there's really a pastoral need of people here. How many people they make up as far as same-sex unions, I don't know. And it's really
Right.
irrelevant. The point is there's a real pastoral need to address that group of people. Now, I recognize that doesn't describe everybody who's in these unions. I mean, there's plenty of people who are just given over to their sin and they don't care. And they do want the church to validate their disordered union.
Correct.
But what I'm saying is there's enough guardrails in Fiducia Supplicans that if you're somehow giving approbation to the union, you're just doing so completely violating and disregarding the guardrails of Fiducia Supplicans, to which I would then note, it doesn't matter how clear, it doesn't matter how many rules and how many guardrails you have. People who want to do that will do that no matter what, with or without this document, with or without clarity. If somebody wants to do something wrong, they're going to do it. But you can't blame the document for that.
But my question goes back to that. What likelihood would two people spontaneously go forward to get a blessing?
Let's say, sure. So he gives an example. Like, let's say you have this same-sex couple who's on pilgrimage. And perhaps even prior to going, they're like pretty given over to this thing and they don't even feel convicted. But on this pilgrimage, they feel inspired, and they feel like, okay, you know what, we're not really living right here. And I want to change my life, and we want to change our lives, and we want to start detaching ourselves from these sins. I could totally see a same-sex couple coming up and asking for a simple blessing to be freed from that in that situation. And I found the quote, by the way, right after the peace, health, and other good things. He says, at the same time, when they ask that they may live the gospel of Christ in full fidelity, and so that the Holy Spirit can free these two people from everything that does not correspond to his divine will, and from everything that requires purification. And I could see these two people in this situation where they kind of feel like, you know what, I'm convicted by this relationship, but I'm also fully not ready to have this firm purpose of amendment. I mean, I think we both know from experience, we might recognize that we have a sin, but sometimes it's like, you know what, I'm not fully ready to give it up yet. And I need help to give that up. So I'm not fully ready for confession, but I'm also not, I don't want to have this in my life anymore. And a simple blessing like this could give them enough grace to get to that point of repentance. And that's exactly what it's supposed to be for. So it meets a real pastoral need. What do you think of that?
I'm not against the pastoral need of praying for repentance or these individuals who are struggling. I think that the problem is I compare this to like Andy Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
Andy Stanley says a lot of things that make you scratch your head, but he says just enough of the right things that you're confused about where he really, it's like, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know where you are in this. It's kind of, to me, this has left so much confusion. And the evidence of that is there's people uproared everywhere. The Pope has been making statements for however many years Pope Francis has been. I don't know what his first year was. You probably know that better than I do. It's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most controversial that has been put out. It's caused confusion, and to you it is clear, and I think to most people it is like, as far as like what is a marriage, what is a blessing in the sacramental sense. I don't think anybody's debating the first or second section of the document. Not to my knowledge. Maybe they are. It's like, I think I know what you're saying, but I don't know where you stand, because it seems like there's so much open door, enough for an abuser like Martin and others to continue, because he ain't the only one. He's just the one making the New York Times. It just, to me, the scenarios that are being painted, I don't think are realistic. The spontaneous movement. Could there be somebody like that? Yes. But why would you put out an entire document to appeal to a hypothetical situation that's probably not going to happen in most masses on a Sunday?
This isn't during mass anyways, but no.
Or any
I
kind
think
of
you're
gathering.
reading too much into it. First of all, you say that it caused confusion. I don't concede that. What caused confusion is the numerous Pope Francis critics who came out that day lying about what Pope Francis actually said in the document, and created an artificial confusion, which they had been doing for quite some time now. So
Sure.
I don't think that the document caused confusion. I think that the critics caused a lot of confusion. They're saying that the Pope Francis now approves blessings of gay unions, like the relationship.
He didn't say that.
But all of that caused a great deal of confusion. So I'm not buying it. But you ask why? Like, why is it?
Yeah.
It's like this little group of people. Why this document? This is part of a broader issue. This document was written as a refutation of the German bishops. The German bishops have been pushing for liturgical blessings, normalizing of same-sex acts to say they're no longer sinful, and to blessing the same-sex unions. Fiducia Supplicans was written to refute that. Everybody's been asking, hey, what's the Vatican doing about all these German bishops teaching all this stuff? Well, here you go. Here's a direct response to that. And rather than conservative Catholics saying, oh, look at this wonderful document that shuts the door on the German bishops and corrects them, we took Fiducia Supplicans, handed it over to the liberals to shoot at conservative Catholics now, when really this was a gun to shoot at the liberals and the German bishops. And it's ridiculous, because it's like, this document is exactly what we've been asking for to refute the German bishops. And we go and give it to the liberals. It's such an odd thing. So I know we're up against the clock here, so I want to give you the final word.
The German bishops, for example, this kind of goes back to the question you posed about maybe the potential of things happening in the AECNA and so forth, which again I don't dispute. But the fact that the German bishops still have their positions, isn't that no different than if people in the Anglican communion started changing their positions on things and maintaining their positions and creating problems? So I just wonder why nothing's being done.
No, things are being done. And so Pope Francis has multiple times told them to stop. And also they're now bringing them over, some of the heads here of the German Episcopal Conference, bringing them over to Rome, telling them very clearly, here's what you can do and not do. They're trying to exhaust all of these means before we end up in a formal schism. Because here's the thing. If Pope Francis were to just replace the vast majority of these German bishops, you automatically have overnight a new church in Germany. Now, how many times in church history have we healed a formal schism? Not many times. We still have schisms going back 1,600 years.
Of course.
The last thing you want is another formal schism. They are already, some of these German bishops are already material in schism.
Sure.
And
especially the whole country. Yeah.
Well, not all of the German bishops, right? There's some good ones, but
of course,
a lot of them are in, well, I would say material schism and definitely material heresy. But the Vatican is trying to bring them back before it's a formal schism, because once it's a formal schism, that thing's not going to be healed, and it will probably gain a lot of traction, and it's going to destroy a lot of lives who come, in lives that are born in that communion. So I think the Vatican is exhausting everything that it can, all of the resources. before it comes to that. And clearly, look, if you follow the situation with what Rome is doing in response to the Germans, Rome is literally bending over backwards to prevent them from forming a schism. And at the end of the day, it may not be enough. We might still end up having one.
Yeah, I think the schism already exists. It's just not full blown.
Materially, it's material.
Material. Yeah,
they're already materially in schism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another way to silence some of the confusion or skeptics of the really Fernandez or Pope Francis at this point would be, and I know that I think the Vatican is aware of Father Martin more than maybe you think they are. I think the way to fix criticism and confusion would actually be to do something with him, because if he is wrongly using this document to his advantage publicly, I mean, again, it's not like it's just made the local news in a town. It's in the New York, it's in the New York Times. It's been spread. I'm quite confident that somebody around, if it's not Pope Francis, because he's not sitting there on Twitter, but I'm sure someone there has informed him of the way this has gone. The way to fix this, in my opinion, and the way to cause less confusion for people or question the integrity of the document is to take the abusers of it that have become national problems. Because I would say James Martin is beyond a local problem. He's a national problem. When you get into the New York Times, and you know they're going to use that to exploit an agenda, and you still go along with it anyway, and you perfectly on purpose put two guys holding hands together in front of you and take a picture in front of the New York Times photographer.
Yeah, that was deliberate. Yeah.
Oh, it was maliciously deliberate. At that point, I think a public discipline.
Oh, I agree.
Even if it's by the American bishops. I mean, the American bishops doing it. Would be
that'll be the day. That would be nice, though.
but I think that would. I think if the Roman Catholics want to see unity around this document, it would be to do things like this. And I'm on the outside looking in. I have a lot of family that's split on this. I think their hearts would be a lot more settled if not every single person, but people that have made this the national confusion or the national abuse were nationally disciplined.
I agree.
I think a lot of this will go away.
I think so. I think that it could help minimize the damage at this point. I think it really, really needs to be done. Here's a weakness. I honestly think that in some cases, perhaps Pope Francis isn't as aware of how bad the situation is. He's probably aware of what James Martin has done in this case. I don't know if he realizes how bad it is, though, in the way that we would, given how active we might be on social media. I also don't know how aware some of the bishops are, given how busy they are with all they're doing. I'm not sure how aware they are of what the situation really is on the ground, because it goes both ways. It's not just your Father James Martin's. Oh, what about all your conservative Catholics, including bishops, who are saying Pope Francis is a heretic? Nothing's being done about them. Not a single thing. What about the ones that are saying Pope Francis isn't even the Pope anymore and are now establishing new seminaries and are illicitly ordaining people? Nothing's being done about them. So it's both sides. It's not just your Father James Martins that need discipline at this point. It's the other side that also needs some severe discipline. I think what we need is balanced discipline all around. And I'm going to continue to say, in the post-conciliar era, we're really weak in church discipline. And I think there's reasons why, but none of them are legit.
I think all groups of churches, Protestant, Anglican,
it's everybody.
I think we've all gotten pretty loose on that. It used to be a more common thing. It's a less common thing because we don't want to hurt people's feelings, etc. But yeah, that's a societal, I think, problem in the modern era for sure. But well, anyway, that's good discussion.
Hey, we got to do it again. I know we're up against the clock here, but I'd love to talk to you more. I know we had some other things we were going to touch on too. Sure. So anytime you want to come back on and talk, let's do it.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and thanks for letting me share a little bit of a journey
Absolutely.
moving Anglicanism. So good stuff.
You're always welcome to come on. Tell the audience, put in a plug, tell them where they can go to find out more about you.
Yeah, so we started an apologetics ministry called Explore Christianity. You can find it at explorechristianity.net, written blogs, etc. Most of my research is in the canon and textual criticism. So when you look for me, most of my public statements or things like that are going to be through my podcast, and it's called FACTS, FACTS. It's an acronym, which stands for Fathers, Apocryphal, Canon, Text, and Scripture. So anything that's on there, we typically, put it out. You can find it on Spotify, you can find it on Apple, Chrome, any of the Google platforms. There's like 17 podcast platforms. I didn't even know it was out there on. Apparently, it distributes it to all of them for me. But
Yeah.
We just started doing things on YouTube. We transferred our one account over. So we, just getting launched on the YouTube side of things. You can find that it's under Explore Christianity's YouTube channel, but just the audio version is Facts. Just put FACTS and you can put my name, Stephen Boyce. It should punch it up. It's going to be like a bluish gray color with the Jerusalem cross on the top of it. And you just click that and you can find all the episodes. We go through historicity, the text, how each book is canonical, how they're traced to the prophets or in the New Testament to an apostle or somebody overseeing somebody do it like Luke. You can go through all those episodes. We go through the church fathers. We just did a short series on the 7 letters of Ignatius. We talk about all kinds of different things. So feel free to check those out.
Awesome. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Like I said, you're welcome on anytime. This was an absolute delight. Love having conversations with you. So again, come on anytime you want.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyce. Everybody hit that like button and the subscribe button. All right. We'll see you later. God bless.